Millionaire walks through mansion and sees cleaning lady crying. What she reveals shocked him. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The Tuesday morning sun filtered through the French windows of the Whitmore mansion, casting golden patterns across the Italian marble that stretched through the corridors of the most luxurious estate in the Hamptons. Charles Whitmore, at 52 years old, walked with measured steps through the halls of his $15 million home, mentally reviewing his day's agenda. Wearing a perfectly tailored navy Armani suit, his salt and pepper hair impeccably styled, Charles embodied the image of success that had taken him decades to build. Yet behind his steel-gray eyes lay a loneliness that no amount of wealth could fill. The mansion itself was a testament to his achievements, a sprawling 12,000-square-foot Georgian estate with pristine white columns, manicured gardens that rolled down to the Atlantic coastline, and interiors that had been featured in Architectural Digest 3 times. Every room spoke of careful curation. Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes, original Monet paintings, and furniture that had once belonged to American industrialists of the Gilded Age. Charles paused near the grand staircase, its mahogany banister polished to perfection, listening to the familiar sounds of his household staff beginning their morning routines. The gentle hum of the kitchen, the distant sound of vacuum cleaners, the quiet efficiency of a home maintained by people he barely knew despite employing them for years. It was then that an unfamiliar sound caught his attention, soft sobbing coming from the direction of his private library. Frowning, Charles followed the sound down the West Wing corridor, past oil portraits of ancestors he'd never met, toward the library where he conducted his most important business calls. The heavy oak doors were slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could see Elena Rodriguez, his housekeeper of 3 years, sitting hunched over at his mahogany desk. Elena was a woman of 48 with kind dark eyes and graying black hair, usually pulled back in a practical bun. Her small frame was always impeccably dressed in the gray uniform she wore with quiet dignity. She had been recommended by his previous housekeeper, a woman who had praised Elena's attention to detail and discretion, qualities Charles valued above all else in his staff. In her weathered hands, Elena clutched a yellowed envelope, its edges worn soft with age. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at whatever lay before her on the desk. Charles had never seen any of his employees cry in his home. The sight made him deeply uncomfortable. "Elena." Charles's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "What are you doing in here?" Elena's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise, and something else. Fear? Guilt? She quickly began gathering the papers spread across his desk, her hands trembling visibly. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm so sorry. I was just dusting your desk, and I found." Her voice broke, and fresh tears began flowing. "I should have never looked, but when I saw the name—" "What name?" Charles stepped closer, his businessman's instincts kicking in. In his world, information was power, and secrets were dangerous. "Elena, you need to explain what's happening here." She held up the envelope with shaking fingers. The return address, though faded, was clearly visible. Suffolk County Social Services, 1983. Charles felt his blood turn cold. That was the year he'd been adopted, the year his life had truly begun, and the year he'd lost everything that came before. "This letter," Elena whispered, her accent thicker than usual with emotion. "It's about 2 children. A boy named Carlos Mendoza and a girl named Esperanza Mendoza. They were separated when they were 7 and 5 years old." She looked up at him with eyes that suddenly seemed familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. "Carlos, that was your birth name, wasn't it?" The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Charles gripped the back of a leather chair, his knuckles white against the burgundy material. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because Esperanza is Spanish for hope," Elena said, standing slowly, her voice gaining strength. "And when our parents used to hold us at night, they would call you Carlos, mi principe, and mi Esperanza, mi princesa." She took a step toward him, and Charles saw his own gray eyes reflected in her tear-stained face. "I've been cleaning your house for 3 years, watching you from across these rooms, knowing but never daring to believe until I found this letter in that old trunk you asked me to clean out from the attic." "That's impossible," Charles said, but even as the words left his mouth, fragments of memory began surfacing. A lullaby sung in Spanish, small hands holding his. A woman with Elena's eyes kissing his forehead. We were told our parents abandoned us. No, hermano, Elena whispered, using the Spanish word for brother that seemed to unlock something deep within both of them. They didn't abandon us. They were destroyed by people who wanted something they had, and we were just casualties in their greed. Charles sank into his chair, the magnitude of the revelation crashing over him like a wave. For 40 years, he had built his life on the foundation of being unwanted, unloved, abandoned. The fear of abandonment had driven every relationship decision, every business move, every moment of his carefully constructed existence. Elena, Esperanza. He said her name like a prayer he'd forgotten he knew. How long have you known? Since the day I started working here, she admitted. But what could I say? Hello, Mr. Whitmore. I'm your long-lost sister. Now please let me clean your bathroom. She laughed through her tears, a sound both bitter and hopeful. I took this job to be close to you, to watch over you like I couldn't when we were children. The silence stretched between them, 40 years of separation condensed into a single moment of recognition. Outside, the Atlantic waves crashed against the Hamptons shoreline, the same rhythm that had played soundtrack to countless lonely evenings in this house. But now, for the first time since his wife Victoria had left 2 years ago, Charles didn't feel alone. The revelation hung in the air between them like morning fog over the Atlantic, dense with implications neither sibling could fully grasp. Charles remained seated, his normally perfect posture slumped as he processed the seismic shift in his understanding of himself. Elena stood uncertainly by the window, her cleaning supplies abandoned on a side table, watching her brother with the careful attention she'd perfected over 3 years of silent observation. Show me everything, Charles finally said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I need to see it all. Elena returned to the desk and carefully spread out the contents of the envelope. There were official documents from Suffolk County Social Services, faded photographs, and handwritten letters in Spanish that made Charles's chest ache with half-remembered recognition. The photographs were particularly devastating. 2 small children clinging to each other while adults in suits looked on with bureaucratic indifference. Jesus Christ, Charles whispered, picking up a photo of himself at 7 years old, his arm protectively around a 5-year-old Elena. I remember this day. They told us we were going on a car ride to meet nice families who would take care of us. They separated us in the parking lot of the social services building, Elena said, her voice steady but her hands trembling as she pointed to another document. You went with the Whitmores to Manhattan. I went with the Rodriguez family to Queens. They promised we could write letters, but... She gestured helplessly at the scattered papers. But the letters never came. Charles finished, memories flooding back like a dam breaking. I wrote to you every week for 2 years. My adoptive parents said the letters were being sent, but you never wrote back. Eventually, they convinced me to stop trying. Elena's face crumpled with fresh tears. I wrote too, hermano. Every single week. Mrs. Rodriguez would take my letters and promise to mail them, but years later I found them all in a shoebox in her closet. She said it was for my own good, that I needed to move forward and not live in the past. The cruelty of it hit Charles like a physical blow. 2 children, already traumatized by loss, had been systematically prevented from maintaining their bond by adults who thought they knew better. The businessman in him recognized the calculated nature of the deception. Someone had made a deliberate decision to sever their connection completely. The Whitmores, Charles said slowly, remembering his adoptive parents with new clarity. They were kind enough, but they never talked about my past. Whenever I asked about you or our biological parents, they'd change the subject. They said dwelling on the past would prevent me from appreciating my new opportunities. Elena nodded grimly. The Rodriguez family was the same. They gave me love, don't misunderstand. They raised me well. But they made it clear that my previous life was something to be forgotten, not honored. Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured gardens that cost him $50,000 a year to maintain. Everything in his life was ordered, controlled, predictable, except for this. Except for Elena. Why didn't you tell me when you first started working here? He asked, not turning around. 3 years, Elena. 3 years you've been watching me live my life, while knowing we were family. Her reflection appeared beside his in the window glass. What would you have believed? Your housekeeper claiming to be your long-lost sister? You would have thought I was trying to con you. maybe extort money. She paused, her voice growing softer. Besides, I needed to understand who you'd become first. I needed to know if my little brother was still in there somewhere. And what did you discover? Elena smiled sadly. I discovered a man who works 18-hour days because silence makes him uncomfortable. A man who's incredibly generous to his employees, but won't let anyone get close enough to really know him. A man who stands in this beautiful house every evening and looks so lonely it breaks my heart. The accuracy of her observation stung. Charles had built his real estate empire through shrewd investments and calculated risks, but his personal life was a carefully constructed fortress designed to prevent exactly the kind of pain he was feeling now. Victoria left because of that loneliness, he admitted. She said living with me was like being married to a ghost. I gave her everything money could buy, but I couldn't give her myself. Because you were terrified she'd leave anyway, Elena said with the insight of someone who'd watched him for years. Just like everyone else had left. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted their conversation. Charles quickly moved to the door and closed it firmly, buying them privacy. When he turned back, Elena was carefully returning the documents to their envelope. What are you doing? He asked. Putting these away before someone sees them. Before your staff starts talking. Elena, you're my sister. You don't need to hide that. She looked at him with an expression that mixed hope with profound skepticism. Am I, though? Really? Because yesterday I was your housekeeper, and tomorrow your world will tell you I'm a gold digger who invented an elaborate story to get access to your fortune. Charles felt a flash of anger, not at Elena but at the world that had taught her such caution. Do you think so little of me? Do you think I'm that shallow? I think you're a man who's been hurt before and who's learned to protect himself, Elena said gently. I think you're going to spend the next few days wondering if this is real, if I'm real, if any of it matters after 40 years. She was right, and they both knew it. Charles had survived in business by questioning everything, trusting carefully, and always having an exit strategy. But this wasn't business. This was family, a concept he'd almost forgotten how to navigate. There's something else, Elena said, pulling out one final document from the envelope. Something about our parents. About why we were really separated. Charles took the paper with hands that weren't quite steady. It was a property deed, dated just months before their separation, transferring ownership of a 100-acre farm in upstate New York from Miguel and Carmen Mendoza to Suffolk County Social Services. Our parents owned land, he said, the implications beginning to dawn on him. Valuable land, Elena confirmed. Land that someone wanted very badly, badly enough to destroy a family to get it. The businessman in Charles immediately began calculating. 100 acres in New York, even 40 years ago, would have been worth significant money. Today, depending on location and development potential, it could be worth millions. Elena, he said slowly, what happened to our parents? Her face darkened. According to what I've been able to piece together over the years, they died in a car accident 6 months after we were taken. Very convenient timing. Charles felt ice water flow through his veins. You think they were murdered? I think they were obstacles to someone's plan, and obstacles have a way of disappearing. Elena's voice carried a hardness he'd never heard before. I think we were separated not to give us better lives, but to ensure we could never come back and ask questions about what happened to our family's land. The magnitude of the conspiracy was staggering. Not just adoption, but potential murder, fraud, and systematic destruction of a family, all for real estate. Charles had made his fortune in property development. He knew how ruthless the industry could be, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined. We need to find out what happened to that land, he said, his business instincts overriding his emotional turmoil. Already done, Elena said with a smile that reminded him suddenly of their childhood. That's why I was crying when you found me. I finally confirmed what I've suspected for years. She pulled out a modern legal document. That land is still ours, hermano. Legally, it never should have been taken. And there are people living on it who've been waiting 40 years for the rightful owners to come home. The legal document Elena placed in Charles's hands felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. His eyes scanned the dense legal terminology, but his mind struggled to process the implications. The deed clearly showed that the transfer of the Mendoza family property to Suffolk County had been fraudulent, signatures forged, witnesses fabricated, and dates altered. How did you get this? Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena walked to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the morning light. I've been working on this for 15 years, ever since I turned 30 and decided I needed to know the truth about our family. I saved every penny I could spare and hired a private investigator. Not some expensive Manhattan firm, but a retired police detective in Queens who specialized in cold cases. 15 years. Charles felt a stab of guilt. While Elena had been scraping together money to uncover their past, he'd been living in luxury, completely unaware that his sister was alive, much less fighting for their family's legacy. His name was Detective Murphy. Elena continued, her voice taking on a reverent tone. Irish cop who'd seen enough corruption to know how these things work. He died 2 years ago, but not before he gave me everything he'd discovered. She turned back to Charles, her eyes blazing with determination. Our parents didn't just own land, hermano. They owned prime development property that's now worth over $20 million. Charles sank into his leather chair, the number hitting him like a physical blow. $20 million. In his world, that was a significant sum, enough to fund major development projects or acquire prime Manhattan real estate. But for their parents, 40 years ago, it would have been life-changing wealth. Who took it? He asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Elena pulled out a manila folder from beneath the other documents. 3 people working together. Logan Mitchell, he was a small-time developer then. Now he's one of the biggest names in luxury resorts on the East Coast. Natalie Cross, she started as Mitchell's assistant. Now she runs Cross Development, the company that built half of the luxury condos in the Hamptons. I know Cross Development, Charles interrupted, his blood chilling. I've done business with them. Natalie and I have been to the same charity galas, the same business dinners. He felt sick realizing he'd been socializing with someone who might have destroyed his family. And the third person, Elena said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, was State Senator Richard Coleman. He was just a county supervisor then, but he had connections in social services. He's the one who arranged for us to be separated and ensured the paperwork disappeared. Charles knew that name too. Senator Coleman was a fixture in New York politics, a man who'd built his career on promises of affordable housing and protecting family values. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. They're all still alive, Elena continued. They're all still profiting from what they stole from our family. And according to Detective Murphy's research, we weren't their only victims. They perfected this system, find families with valuable property but limited resources to fight back, create crises that force them out, then swoop in to claim the land. Charles stood and began pacing, his mind racing through possibilities and implications. This wasn't just about their family anymore. This was about systematic fraud on a massive scale. What about the people you mentioned? The ones living on our land? Elena's expression softened. When Mitchell and his partners took the property, they planned to develop it immediately. But there were environmental issues, contaminated soil from an old factory upstream. The development was delayed, then stalled completely when the county changed zoning laws. Rather than leave the property empty, Coleman quietly allowed migrant farm workers to settle there temporarily. That was 40 years ago, Charles said. Exactly. What started as temporary housing became a permanent community. 43 families now live on our land, most of them second and third generation. They've built homes, established farms, created a school. It's become a real community, the kind of place our parents probably dreamed of creating. Charles stopped pacing and looked at his sister with new understanding. And you don't want to displace them. I want justice, Elena said firmly. But not at the expense of innocent people who've built lives on that land. These families didn't steal from us. They're victims too, just pawns in someone else's game. The sound of Charles's cell phone buzzing interrupted their conversation. He glanced at the screen and saw a text from his assistant. Victoria called. Says she's flying back from Paris today. Wants to meet tomorrow. Elena noticed his expression change. Victoria? Your ex-wife? She left for Europe 2 years ago. Said she needed space to find herself. Charles said bitterly. We've barely spoken since the divorce was finalized. I can't imagine what would bring her back now. Maybe she heard something, Elena suggested. If we start investigating this property situation, word might get around certain circles. Charles felt a chill of premonition. Victoria had always been well-connected in New York society, moving in circles that included developers, politicians, and old money families. If someone had tipped her off about potential legal action involving valuable property. There's something else, Elena said, interrupting his thoughts. Detective Murphy discovered that our parents didn't just own that 100 acres. There were other properties, smaller parcels throughout upstate New York. If we can prove fraud on the main property, we might be able to uncover a much larger conspiracy, Charles finished. The businessman in him was already calculating the potential scope. If Mitchell, Cross, and Coleman had been systematically defrauding families for decades, the financial implications could be staggering. But Elena, he said carefully, if we pursue this, we're not just fighting for money or property. We're taking on people with serious political and financial power. They destroyed our family once. What makes you think they won't try again? Elena walked over to where Charles stood and, for the first time in 40 years, placed her hand on her brother's arm. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of decades of separation and loss. Because this time, we're not powerless children, she said. You have resources, connections, influence. I have the truth, the evidence, and 40 years of anger to fuel me. Together, we're not the same helpless kids they separated all those years ago. Charles looked down at his sister's hand on his arm and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the sense of having family, of belonging to something bigger than himself. But along with that warmth came fear. Elena was right that they weren't powerless children anymore, but their opponents weren't small-time county officials either. They were dealing with people who had spent 40 years accumulating power and perfecting their methods. If we do this, Charles said slowly, there's no going back. Once we start digging, they'll know we're coming for them. And people with this much to lose don't just quietly surrender. Elena smiled, and for the first time, Charles could see the fierce little girl who had once promised to protect him from the monsters under their shared bed. Good, she said. I've been waiting 40 years for them to know I'm coming. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the Atlantic, and Charles couldn't shake the feeling that the weather was an omen. The peaceful morning that had started with routine and ended with revelation was about to give way to something much more turbulent. As he looked at Elena, his sister, his family, his partner in what was sure to be the fight of their lives, he realized that for the first time since Victoria left, he wasn't afraid of the storm. He was ready to create one. The next morning arrived gray and ominous, matching Charles's mood as he stood in his bedroom overlooking the churning Atlantic. He'd barely slept, his mind cycling through 40 years of memories that now demanded re-examination. Every achievement, every relationship, every moment of loneliness took on new meaning in the light of Elena's revelation. The phone on his nightstand buzzed insistently, his assistant reminding him of Victoria's impending arrival. By 10 a.m., Charles found himself in his study, the same room where his world had shifted yesterday. Elena had arrived early, no longer wearing her housekeeper's uniform, but dressed in simple black slacks and a cream blouse that made her look less like an employee and more like the sister she truly was. She'd spread Detective Murphy's files across the mahogany conference table, creating a timeline that painted a picture of systematic destruction. I've been thinking about what you said, Elena began, her voice steady but her hands betraying nervousness as she organized the documents. About the danger of pursuing this. Maybe you're right. Maybe some sleeping dogs should lie. Charles looked at her sharply. You don't believe that. I believe that I've spent 3 years watching you rebuild your life after Victoria left. You're successful, respected, financially secure. Why risk all of that for something that happened 40 years ago? Because, Charles said, moving to stand beside her at the table, 40 years ago, they didn't just steal property. They stole us from each other. They stole our parents' lives. They stole our childhoods. He picked up a photograph of their parents, a young couple standing proudly in front of a small farmhouse. How many other families did they destroy? How many other children grew up thinking they were abandoned when they were actually stolen? Elena's composure cracked slightly. But what if we lose? What if they're too powerful, too connected? What if they... The sound of car tires on gravel interrupted her. Through the window, they could see a black Mercedes sedan pulling up the circular driveway. Victoria had arrived. She's early, Charles muttered, quickly gathering the documents. We need to put these away. Why? Elena asked. If she's part of your life. She's not, Charles said firmly. Not anymore. And I don't trust her timing. He looked at Elena seriously. I need you to go back to your quarters for now. Let me handle this first. Elena bristled. I'm not hiding from your ex-wife, Hamano. It's not about hiding. It's about strategy. We don't know why she's here, and until we do, we keep our discovery between us. Reluctantly, Elena gathered the files and slipped out through the side door just as the doorbell chimed. Charles took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and prepared to face the woman who had once promised to love him forever. Victoria Whitmore. She'd kept his name despite the divorce, swept into the foyer like she owned the place. At 45, she was still stunning in the way that money could maintain. Perfectly styled blonde hair, designer clothes that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and the kind of confident poise that came from never having to worry about anything as mundane as bills or consequences. "Charles," she said, offering her cheek for a kiss that felt as cold as the October wind. "You look well. Country life agrees with you." "Victoria." He kept his voice neutral, professional. "This is unexpected. I thought you were enjoying Paris." "Paris was lovely, but one can only eat so many croissants," she said with a laugh that sounded rehearsed. "Besides, I missed New York. I missed us." Charles led her into the living room, noting how her eyes scanned the space as if cataloging changes. Everything looked the same as when she'd left. The same furniture, the same art, the same carefully curated perfection that had characterized their marriage. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Water?" Charles asked, falling back on the formal politeness that had defined their relationship toward the end. "Coffee would be lovely." Victoria settled onto the cream-colored sofa, crossing her legs with practiced elegance. "I see you still have the same housekeeper. The Spanish girl? She let me in." "Elena," Charles said carefully. "Yes, she's reliable. I always liked her. So quiet, so unobtrusive. The best kind of help, really." Victoria's tone was casual, but Charles detected something underneath, a probing quality that put him on edge. The coffee arrived, brought by Elena herself, who moved with professional efficiency while avoiding eye contact with both of them. Charles watched Victoria watch Elena, noting the way his ex-wife's gaze lingered on his sister's face. "Thank you, Elena," Victoria said with exaggerated warmth. "How are you?" "Still taking care of our Charles. He takes good care of himself, Mrs. Whitmore," Elena replied diplomatically before excusing herself. Once they were alone, Victoria leaned forward, her expression growing serious. "Charles, I came back because I've been hearing things. Disturbing things." "What kind of things?" "People in my circles in Europe. You know how these things travel. They're saying you've been asking questions about property deals from decades ago. Old deals involving families who aren't around to ask questions anymore." Charles felt ice water in his veins, but kept his expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Come now, Charles. We were married for 12 years. I know when you're being evasive." Victoria set down her coffee cup with a delicate clink. "There are people who are concerned that you might be pursuing something that could be uncomfortable for everyone involved." "Everyone?" Charles asked. "Who exactly is everyone, Victoria?" She hesitated for just a moment, and in that pause, Charles saw something that confirmed his worst suspicions. Victoria hadn't come back because she missed him or their life together. She'd come back because someone had sent her. "Look, darling," she continued, using the endearment that had once made his heart skip but now sounded calculated. "Whatever you think you've discovered, whatever grievance you believe you have, it's ancient history. Some doors are better left closed. And if I choose to open them anyway?" Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. "Then you might find that the cost is higher than you're prepared to pay. Your reputation, your business relationships, your standing in the community, all of it could be at risk." "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning. From someone who cares about you." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds. "This is a beautiful life you've built here, Charles. Don't let old ghosts destroy what's real and present." Charles joined her at the window, standing close enough to smell her expensive perfume, but feeling more distant from her than ever. What if those ghosts represent something more important than comfort? What if they represent justice? "Justice?" Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Justice is a luxury for people who don't have anything real to lose. You have businesses, investments, relationships that depend on maintaining certain understandings. Some stones are better left unturned." "Whose stones, Victoria? Who sent you here?" She turned to face him fully, and for the first time since her arrival, He saw genuine emotion in her eyes, fear. Charles, please. I'm trying to protect you. There are people with very long memories and very deep pockets who don't want their past decisions scrutinized. People like Logan Mitchell, Natalie Cross, Senator Coleman. Victoria's face went white. The fact that he knew those names clearly shocked her more than she'd expected. How do you know about them? Charles finished. Let's just say I've been doing my homework. Then you know how dangerous this is, Victoria said urgently. These aren't people you can fight in court or expose in the press. They have too much power, too many connections. They can destroy you without even breaking a sweat. Maybe, Charles said, but they've already destroyed something precious to me. The question is, what's left to lose? Victoria stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her recalculating, trying to understand this version of her ex-husband who seemed willing to risk everything for principle. There's always something left to lose, Charles, she said finally. And if you pursue this, you'll discover just how much that can be. As she gathered her purse and prepared to leave, Charles felt the weight of the decision before him. Victoria's visit had confirmed what he'd suspected. Powerful people were already aware of his investigation and were mobilizing to stop him. The comfortable life he'd built in the Hamptons suddenly felt very fragile. Victoria, he called as she reached the door. One last question. Did you ever love me? Really love me? She paused, her hand on the door handle, and for a moment, she looked like the woman he'd married instead of the messenger she'd become. I loved the life we had, she said softly. But Charles, you never let me love you. You were always so afraid I'd leave that you never gave me a reason to stay. After she left, Charles stood alone in his living room, surrounded by the trappings of success that suddenly felt as fragile as paper. Through the window, he could see Elena in the garden, waiting for the all-clear. His sister, the family he'd thought he'd lost forever, was ready to stand with him against whatever came next. The choice was no longer about property or money or even justice. It was about whether he was finally ready to stop running from the possibility of loss and start fighting for what mattered most. That evening, Charles found Elena in the mansion's commercial-grade kitchen, standing at the massive granite island with Detective Murphy's files spread before her like battle plans. She'd changed into jeans and a sweater, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her in the 3 years she'd worked for him. The transformation from employee to family member was still jarring, but somehow right. So, Elena said without looking up from the documents, how did it go with the Ice Queen? Charles couldn't help but smile at the nickname. You heard, the walls in this place aren't as thick as you think, and Victoria never was good at keeping her voice down when she was angry. Elena finally looked up, her dark eyes serious. She came here to scare you off, didn't she? Among other things. Charles pulled up a stool across from her, noting how different the kitchen felt at night. Warmer somehow, more human than the sterile perfection of the rest of the house. She knew about our investigation, Elena. She knew names, details. Someone sent her. Of course they did. Elena's voice carried a bitter edge. 40 years later, and they're still trying to control us, still trying to keep us separated and powerless. Charles studied his sister's face, seeing the anger that had been building for decades. There's something else. Victoria warned me about the cost of pursuing this. Not just financial, but personal. My reputation, my business relationships, everything I've built. And I realized something. Charles paused, choosing his words carefully. I've spent my entire adult life building walls to protect myself from loss. I've accumulated wealth, property, social status, all of it designed to make me invulnerable. But what's the point of being invulnerable if you're also alone? Elena reached across the island and placed her hand over his. You're not alone anymore, Hamano. I know. And maybe that's what scares them the most. Not that we've discovered the truth about the past, but that we've found each other again. The kitchen fell into comfortable silence, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the shore. Charles found himself remembering fragments of their childhood, Elena teaching him to tie his shoes, the way she would sing to him when thunderstorms frightened him, how she'd always been the brave one despite being younger. I've made a decision, Charles said finally. We're going to pursue this, no matter what the cost. But I need to know everything first, not just about the property, but about what happened to our parents, about the other families they destroyed. Elena smiled, and it transformed her entire face. I was hoping you'd say that. Because I've been holding back some information, waiting to see if you were really ready for this fight. She pulled out a thick manila envelope from beneath the other documents. Detective Murphy didn't just investigate our case. Before he died, he compiled evidence on 17 other families who lost property to the same group over a 20-year period. 17 families? 17 that he could document. There were probably more. Elena opened the envelope, revealing photographs, legal documents, and handwritten notes. Most of the families were Hispanic, some were black, a few were poor white families. All of them owned property that became valuable as development moved north from the city. Charles examined the photographs, family portraits that could have been mirrors of their own childhood. Children who would now be adults, scattered to the winds, probably never knowing what had been stolen from them. "This is bigger than just us," he said quietly. "Much bigger." And Detective Murphy believed that if we could prove fraud in our case, with the solid documentation we have, it could open the door for other families to seek justice too. The magnitude of it was overwhelming. They weren't just fighting for themselves, or even for their parents' memory. They were potentially fighting for dozens of families, hundreds of people who had been victims of systematic fraud. "Elena," Charles said carefully, "if we do this, if we really go after them, there's no guarantee we'll win. These people have had 40 years to cover their tracks, to build their power base. We could lose everything and still not get justice." "I know." Elena's voice was steady, resolved. "But what's the alternative? We let them get away with it? We let all those other families never know the truth about what happened to them?" Charles was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the conversation with Victoria, about the implicit threats, about the comfortable life he would be risking. Then he thought about the photograph of their parents, young and hopeful, standing in front of the farmhouse that should have been their children's inheritance. "There's something else I need to tell you," Elena said, interrupting his thoughts. "About the people living on our land now. What about them?" Elena pulled out a folder labeled Current Residents, Mendoza Property. Inside were photographs of families, children playing, gardens flourishing, small houses that had been built with care and pride despite their humble materials. "I drove up there last month," Elena confessed. "I needed to see it for myself, to understand what we'd be walking into." Charles looked up sharply. "You went alone?" "Elena, that was dangerous. I was careful. I told them I was doing research for a documentary about migrant farm communities." She smiled at the memory. "They welcomed me like family, invited me to stay for dinner, showed me around their school and their church. It's beautiful, Charles. It's what a real community looks like. And there's an old man there, Mr. Washington, who's been there since the beginning. He knew our parents." Elena's voice grew thick with emotion. "He said they were good people, that they helped other families when they could, that they dreamed of turning the property into some kind of cooperative farming community." Charles felt a stab of loss for parents he barely remembered. "What else did he tell you?" "He said that the night before they died, our father came to see him. He was scared, said he'd been getting threats, that people wanted him to sell the land, but he refused because it was his children's inheritance." Elena wiped away tears. "Our father died protecting our future, hermano. The least we can do is honor that sacrifice." The weight of responsibility settled on Charles's shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about honoring their parents' memory and protecting the community that had grown up on their land. "If we win," Charles said slowly, "if we get the property back, what happens to the families living there?" "We make our parents' dream come true," Elena said with quiet determination. "We create the cooperative community they envisioned. We give those families legal ownership of their homes, help them establish sustainable farming operations, provide resources for education and healthcare. That would cost millions. Then it's a good thing one of us is a successful real estate developer," Elena said with a smile that reminded Charles of their childhood mischief. Charles laughed despite the gravity of their situation. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose beyond just accumulating wealth. "Okay," he said, "let's do this. But we do it smart, we do it carefully, and we do it together." Elena stood and walked around the island to embrace her brother, the first physical affection they'd shared since being separated as children. "Together," she agreed. As they held each other, Charles could hear the Atlantic wind picking up outside, rattling the windows of his perfect mansion. The storm that had been brewing since Victoria's visit was about to break. But for the first time in his life, Charles wasn't afraid of being swept away. He had his sister back. He had a purpose worth fighting for. And he had 40 years of anger to fuel what was sure to be the battle of their lives. "Where do we start?" he asked. Elena smiled, and Charles could see their father's determination in her eyes. "We start by visiting our land. It's time you met the people who've been taking care of our parents' dream." Outside, lightning illuminated the Hamptons coastline, and Charles realized that the storm wasn't coming for them. They were about to become the storm. The drive upstate took them through autumn landscapes that Charles hadn't seen in years. Rolling hills painted in gold and crimson, small towns that existed far from the glittering bubble of the Hamptons, farmland that stretched to horizons unmarked by skyscrapers or development projects. Elena sat beside him in his Range Rover, nervously adjusting the flowers they'd brought for their parents' unmarked grave, which Mr. Washington had told her about during her previous visit. "Are you nervous?" Elena asked as they turned onto a dirt road marked only by a faded sign. "Private property. No trespassing." "Terrified," Charles admitted, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "I've negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, but the thought of meeting these people, of seeing our parents' land." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The road wound through thick woods before opening into a valley that took Charles's breath away. Spread before them was a thriving community unlike anything he'd expected. Small but well-maintained houses dotted the landscape, connected by gravel paths and surrounded by gardens that even in October showed signs of careful tending. Children played in a central area where someone had built playground equipment from reclaimed wood, while adults worked in what appeared to be a communal garden. "My God," Charles whispered, stopping the car at the crest of the hill. "It's beautiful. It's what our parents dreamed of," Elena said softly. "A place where families could work together, support each other, build something lasting." As they drove down into the community, people began to emerge from their homes and work areas. Charles felt dozens of eyes on them, curious, cautious, but not hostile. A group of children ran alongside the car, laughing and waving, while adults watched with the careful politeness of people who had learned to be wary of outsiders. They parked near what appeared to be the community center, a larger building that looked like it had been constructed from salvaged materials, but with obvious skill and care. An elderly black man emerged from the building, moving slowly but with dignity intact. Even from a distance, Charles could see this was someone the community respected. "That's Mr. Washington," Elena said. "He's 78 years old, been here since 1985. He's sort of the unofficial mayor." Mr. Washington approached the car with measured steps, his weathered face kind but cautious. He was tall and lean, with white hair and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see everything. When he smiled at Elena, his entire face transformed. "Miss Rodriguez," he said in a voice that carried the wisdom of decades. "You came back, and you brought a friend." "Mr. Washington, this is Charles," Elena said, her voice tight with emotion. "Charles Whitmore. He's my brother." The old man's eyes widened, and he studied Charles with new intensity. "Brother? You mean?" "Carlos Mendoza," Charles said, extending his hand. "I think you knew my parents, Miguel and Carmen." Mr. Washington's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. His eyes filled with tears, and he grasped Charles's hand with both of his own. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. "You look just like your father, just like Miguel when he was young. You really knew them? Knew them? Son, your parents saved my life." Mr. Washington's voice grew stronger, carrying across the gathering crowd. "When I first came here, I was broken down, nowhere to go, nothing left. Miguel and Carmen took me in, gave me work, treated me like family. I've been watching over this place for 40 years, waiting for their children to come home." Word spread quickly through the community, and soon Charles and Elena found themselves surrounded by 3 generations of families. There was Maria Santos, a woman in her 50s who had arrived as a teenager and now ran the community school. Her son David, a college graduate who had chosen to return and help develop sustainable farming techniques. The Gutierrez family, who had built the playground and maintained the communal gardens. The Washingtons' adopted daughter Sarah, a nurse who provided health care for the entire community. "Your parents," said Maria, wiping tears from her eyes. "They had a vision. They said this land should belong to the people who work it, who love it, who build their lives on it. When they died, we thought the dream died with them." "But you stayed," Elena said. You all stayed and kept building. We had nowhere else to go, admitted David. And besides, this felt like home. Miguel always said that home isn't just a place. It's people choosing to take care of each other. Mr. Washington led them to a small cemetery at the edge of the community property. Two simple wooden crosses marked their parents' graves, surrounded by wildflowers that someone tended with obvious care. Charles knelt beside the graves, his expensive suit incongruous among the weeds and flowers, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to cry. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the crosses. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come home. I'm sorry I didn't fight for this place, for these people, for what you believed in." Elena knelt beside him, placing the flowers they'd brought on each grave. "We're here now, Mommy and Poppy. We're going to make this right." As the afternoon wore on, the community shared stories of Miguel and Carmen Mendoza. Charles learned that his father had been a dreamer and an organizer, someone who believed that collective action could overcome individual powerlessness. His mother had been the practical one, a teacher who had started the community school and a healer who grew medicinal herbs. They were planning to make this place legal, Mr. Washington explained as they sat in his small but comfortable home, sharing coffee and homemade bread. They were working with lawyers, trying to set up some kind of cooperative ownership structure. Then the threats started. "What kind of threats?" Charles asked. "Phone calls at first. Anonymous letters. Then people started showing up, men in suits, saying the property was going to be developed, that everyone needed to move. Miguel refused to sell, said this was his children's inheritance. That's when the pressure really intensified," added Maria. "The county started finding code violations, health department issues, problems that had never existed before. It was like someone was systematically trying to make life impossible here. And then our parents died," Elena said quietly. Mr. Washington nodded gravely. "Car accident on Route 17 during a rainstorm. But Miguel was the most careful driver I ever knew. Never drove fast, always checked his brakes, maintained that old pickup truck like it was a Cadillac. You think it wasn't an accident? I think a lot of convenient things happened in a very short period of time," Mr. Washington said carefully. "I think people who wanted this land very badly suddenly found all their problems solved." Charles felt a familiar anger building, the same fury he'd experienced in boardrooms when facing corrupt opponents. But this was different, more personal, more righteous. These weren't just business competitors. These were people who had destroyed his family and threatened an entire community. "Mr. Washington," Charles said, "what would you say if I told you that Elena and I are the legal owners of this property? That we have documentation proving the land was stolen from our family through fraud?" The old man's eye sharpened. "I'd say it's about time someone with the resources to fight back showed up. But I'd also ask what you intend to do with that information." Charles looked around the modest home, out the window at the community his parents had envisioned, at the faces of people who had spent 40 years building something beautiful on land that should have been his inheritance. "I intend to honor my parents' vision," he said. "I want to make this community legal, give every family here ownership of their homes, provide resources for sustainable development, and turn this place into the cooperative they dreamed of creating." "And the people who stole it from us?" Elena asked. Charles's expression hardened. "We make them pay for what they took. Not just the money, though there will be plenty of that, but for the 40 years of lies, the families they destroyed, the dreams they crushed." Mr. Washington studied Charles for a long moment, then smiled. "Miguel would be proud of his son. You've got his fire, but you've also got something he didn't have, the power to actually fight back and win." As evening approached and they prepared to leave, the entire community gathered to see them off. Children pressed handmade drawings into their hands. Adults shared phone numbers and promised to help with whatever came next, and elderly residents offered blessings in Spanish that brought tears to Elena's eyes. "When will you come back?" asked Sarah Washington. "Soon," Charles promised. "Very soon. And when we do, we'll be coming home to stay." The drive back to the Hamptons passed in contemplative silence. Charles's mind was racing with plans, legal strategies, financial projections, development possibilities. But underneath the calculations, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging, of purpose, a family that extended beyond blood to embrace an entire community. "Elena," he said as the lights of the mansion came into view, "are you ready for a war?" "I've been ready for 40 years," she replied. "The question is, Are they ready for us? Charles smiled grimly as he pulled into the circular driveway of his perfect, empty mansion. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of dismantling the comfortable life he'd built and risking everything for something far more important. But tonight, for the first time since childhood, he felt truly rich. The following Monday morning arrived with deceptive calm, the kind of stillness that precedes a hurricane. Charles sat in his home office at dawn, surrounded by legal documents, financial statements, and Detective Murphy's files, methodically building a strategy that would either restore his family's legacy or destroy everything he'd worked to build. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was using his fortune, accumulated through real estate development, to take down the very system that had made him wealthy. Elena entered carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee, no longer the quiet housekeeper, but his full partner in what they'd begun calling Operation Mendoza. She'd spent the weekend researching legal precedents for fraud cases involving property theft, her naturally sharp mind proving invaluable in understanding the complex web of corruption they were unraveling. "I've been thinking about timing," Elena said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "If we're going to do this, we need to move fast. Victoria's visit proves they already know we're investigating." "Agreed. I've already reached out to 3 law firms. Morrison and Associates specialize in property fraud, while Chun and Partners have experience with class action suits against political figures. We'll need both approaches." Charles's phone buzzed with an incoming call from his business manager, Robert Hayes, a man who'd been handling his investments for over a decade. Charles answered on speaker. "Charles, we need to talk." Robert's voice carried an urgency that immediately put them both on alert. "I'm getting calls from some very important people asking questions about your recent activities." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest you might be poking around in areas where poking isn't appreciated." Logan Mitchell's office called this morning, very politely inquiring about whether you might be interested in some mutually beneficial business opportunities. Natalie Cross's assistant reached out about a potential collaboration on a Hamptons development project. Charles and Elena exchanged glances. Their opponents were making the first move, trying to co-opt him with offers of partnership before he could become a threat. And Senator Coleman? His chief of staff wants to schedule a friendly lunch to discuss your concerns about historical property issues. Charles, these aren't coincidences. Someone's been talking. After hanging up, Elena paced to the window, her agitation visible in every step. "They're trying to buy you off before we can build a case. The question is, what happens when they realize you can't be bought?" "Then they'll try other methods," Charles said grimly. "Intimidation, character assassination, maybe worse." "We need allies," Elena said. "People with power who can't be intimidated or bought." Charles had been thinking the same thing. "I have an idea, but it's risky. There's a journalist named Patricia Newman at the New York Times. She's been investigating corruption in state government for 20 years. If we can give her enough evidence to start asking the right questions, the story becomes public before they can stop it," Elena finished. "But that means we lose control of the narrative. We were never going to control the narrative anyway. At least this way, we get our story told by someone with credibility." Their planning was interrupted by the arrival of Charles's longtime accountant, George Morrison, a meticulous man in his 50s who had been managing the Whitmore finances for 15 years. George's usual calm demeanor seemed strained as he entered the office, clutching a leather briefcase like a shield. "Charles, we need to discuss some irregularities I've discovered in your accounts," George said, his voice tight with what Charles initially mistook for professional concern. "What kind of irregularities?" George opened his briefcase with trembling hands, pulling out financial statements that Charles immediately recognized as doctored. Numbers had been altered, transactions fabricated, a paper trail created that painted Charles as someone engaged in tax evasion and fraudulent business practices. "George, what is this?" "I'm sorry, Charles. I'm so sorry." George's composure collapsed entirely, tears streaming down his face. "They have my daughter. Not physically. She's safe. But they control her medical care. The experimental treatments for her leukemia, the specialists, the clinical trials, they can cut off access with one phone call." Elena moved closer, her voice gentle but urgent. "Who, George? Who has that kind of power?" "Mitchell's people. They approached me 6 months ago, said they might need insurance against future problems with Charles. They wanted me to prepare documentation that could be used to question his financial practices if necessary. Charles felt the familiar cold fury building, but forced himself to stay calm. You've been setting me up for 6 months? I never thought they'd actually use it. I thought it was just contingency planning. But then last week, after that woman visited you, they called. Said Charles was becoming problematic, and it was time to deploy the insurance. What woman? Elena asked sharply. His ex-wife. The blonde one. She came here the day before she visited you, Charles. Spent an hour going through files, asking questions about your assets, your business relationships. Charles felt the betrayal like a physical blow. Victoria hadn't just been a messenger. She'd been actively gathering intelligence, helping their enemies prepare for war. George, Charles said quietly, show me everything. Every document they wanted prepared, every conversation you had with them, every detail you can remember. For the next hour, George laid out the full scope of the trap that had been prepared for Charles. Falsified tax returns that suggested offshore accounts, fabricated business deals with questionable partners, a complete financial profile designed to destroy his reputation and credibility. The sophistication of it was breathtaking and terrifying. This isn't just about our property case, Elena realized. They've been preparing to destroy Charles for months, maybe years. This goes way beyond protecting themselves from one fraud lawsuit. It's systematic, Charles agreed. They've done this before, identify potential threats, gather intelligence, prepare weapons to use if necessary. We're not just fighting for our family's land. We're fighting a machine that's been perfected over decades. George wiped his eyes, some of his old steadiness returning. There's more. They didn't just target you, Charles. They've been monitoring Elena too. They know about her investigation, about Detective Murphy's files, about her visits to the community upstate. Elena's face went pale. How long have they been watching me? Since you started working here 3 years ago. They thought it was coincidental at first, just another housekeeper. But when you started asking subtle questions about Charles's background, when you began researching property records, they realized who you were. The full scope of their situation became clear. This wasn't a reaction to their recent discoveries. It was a long-planned campaign of surveillance and manipulation. Elena had been watched for years, Charles had been set up for destruction, and their every move had been anticipated. We're not fighting opponents, Charles said grimly. We're fighting a conspiracy that's been 40 years in the making. So what do we do? Elena asked. Charles looked at his sister, at George's tear-stained face, at the evidence of corruption spread across his desk, and made a decision that would change everything. We stop playing defense, he said. George, I need you to document everything. Every conversation with Mitchell's people, every falsified document they asked you to prepare, every threat they made about your daughter. We're going to expose all of it. Charles, they'll destroy you. The false financial records, the fabricated tax issues, even if you prove they're fake, the damage to your reputation. Let them try, Charles said with cold determination. Elena, call Patricia Newman at the Times. Tell her we have a story that goes to the very heart of corruption in New York State politics and real estate development. Tell her we have documentation going back 40 years. And if they escalate? George asked. If they decide that discrediting you isn't enough? Charles walked to the window, looking out at the Atlantic Ocean that had always represented peace and security. Now it looked like a barrier, something that separated him from the battle he needed to fight. Then we make sure we get our story out before they can silence us, he said. Elena, how quickly can we get everything to the Times? If we work through the night, we can have a complete package ready by tomorrow afternoon. Do it. And George, I want you to know that no matter what happens to me, your daughter will get the medical care she needs. I'll set up a trust fund that's beyond their reach. George's relief was visible, but his fear remained. Charles, these people, they don't just destroy reputations. Detective Murphy's death wasn't natural. The car accident that killed your parents wasn't an accident. If they think you're an existential threat, then we better make sure we're too public to disappear quietly, Charles finished. Elena, it's time to go nuclear. We're not just fighting for our family anymore. We're fighting for everyone they've ever destroyed. As evening fell over the Hamptons, the siblings worked side by side, preparing for a war they might not survive but could no longer avoid. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the Atlantic, and Charles couldn't shake the feeling that the weather was an omen of the tempest they were about to unleash. The comfortable life he'd built was about to be destroyed, but for the first time in years, Charles felt truly alive. The New York Times building in Manhattan hummed with its usual intensity as Charles and Elena arrived for their meeting with Patricia Newman. Charles had insisted they take his driver rather than risk the train. Paranoia was becoming a survival skill. The previous night had been sleepless, spent reviewing documents and preparing for what might be their only chance to get their story into the public domain before their enemies could stop them. Patricia Newman was exactly what Charles had expected from her reputation. A woman in her late 40s with prematurely gray hair, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of focused energy that came from decades of chasing stories that powerful people didn't want told. Her office was cramped but organized, with towers of files and a wall covered in clippings of her investigations into corruption, fraud, and abuse of power. "Mr. Whitmore, Ms. Rodriguez," Patricia said, gesturing to chairs across from her cluttered desk. "I'll be honest. When you called yesterday, I thought this might be another rich man's grievance against the system. But the documents you sent ahead." She tapped a thick folder. "This is something else entirely. How much of it have you been able to verify?" Elena asked. "Enough to know you're not crazy conspiracy theorists. The property transfers, the falsified documents, the pattern of targeting vulnerable families, it's all checking out. But what really caught my attention was the scope." Patricia pulled out a map marked with red pins. "If your allegations are accurate, we're looking at systematic fraud involving dozens of properties worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Charles leaned forward, studying the map. Each red pin represented a family destroyed, children separated, dreams crushed for the sake of profit. "What do you need from us to make this story bulletproof?" "More victims willing to go on the record. Right now, I have your testimony and Detective Murphy's files, but most of his documentation is circumstantial. If I can find other families who were separated, other properties that were stolen, we can help with that," Elena said. "The community living on our parents' land. Some of them remember other families who went through similar experiences." Patricia nodded. "I'll need to interview them directly. But there's something else we need to discuss." Her expression grew serious. "I've been making inquiries about your three suspects, Mitchell, Cross, and Coleman. These aren't just successful business people. They're part of a network that includes judges, prosecutors, and federal officials. If we publish this story, you're not just taking on three individuals. You're challenging an entire power structure." "We understand the risks," Charles said. "Do you?" "Because I've already received 2 phone calls this morning. One from Senator Coleman's office, asking if I was working on any stories involving historical property disputes. Another from Logan Mitchell's legal team, inquiring about the Times' policy on publishing unsubstantiated allegations against respected business leaders." Elena felt her blood chill. "They know we're here. They know something's happening, which means we need to move fast." Patricia pulled out a recording device. "I want to get your full statements on the record today. Everything, childhood memories, the separation, the discovery of your relationship, the evidence you've uncovered." For the next 3 hours, Charles and Elena told their story in excruciating detail. Patricia asked probing questions, challenged inconsistencies, and pushed for specifics that would hold up under legal scrutiny. Charles found himself reliving memories he'd buried for decades. The terror of being taken from Elena, the gradual acceptance that his sister was gone forever, the construction of emotional walls that had defined his adult life. "There's something else," Charles said as the interview was winding down. "My accountant, George Morrison, has been coerced into preparing false financial documents that could be used to destroy my credibility. They've been planning this for months." Patricia's eyes lit up. "Would he go on the record about that coercion?" "If we can guarantee his daughter's safety and medical care, yes." "This is bigger than even you realize," Patricia said, making notes. "If they've been systematically preparing to discredit potential threats, it suggests a level of criminal organization that goes beyond simple real estate fraud." As they prepared to leave, Patricia's phone rang. She answered, her face growing increasingly grim as she listened. When she hung up, she looked at Charles and Elena with obvious concern. "That was my editor. We've received a formal legal notice from a law firm representing all 3 of your suspects. They're threatening a massive libel suit if we publish anything based on unsubstantiated allegations from disgruntled individuals with obvious financial motives." "They're moving fast," Elena said. faster than usual, which suggests either they're more worried than I initially thought, or— Patricia paused, choosing her words carefully. Or they have enough power to shut down the story before it can be published. Charles felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in, but this time he refused to retreat. What do you need to make this story lawsuit-proof? More sources, more documentation, more victims willing to come forward. And we need it quickly. My editor is getting pressure from above to be extremely careful with anything involving Senator Coleman. How much time do we have? Days, maybe a week if we're lucky. After that, the political pressure might become too intense. They left the Times building with a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. As they climbed into Charles's car, Elena noticed a black sedan that had been parked across the street when they arrived was still there, its occupants watching their every move. "We're being followed," she said quietly. Charles glanced in the rearview mirror as his driver pulled into traffic. The sedan followed, maintaining a careful distance but never losing sight of them. "How long do you think we have before they move from surveillance to more direct action?" "Not long," Elena said. "We need to split up, divide their attention. You go back to the Hamptons and work on getting more victims to come forward. I'll go upstate, talk to the community, see if anyone remembers other families who went through what we did." "Absolutely not. We stay together. Charles, be practical. They can't watch both of us if we're in different places. And if something happens to one of us, nothing's going to happen to either of us," Charles said firmly, but his voice carried more hope than conviction. Their driver, a man named Marcus who had been working for Charles for 5 years, caught his eye in the rearview mirror. "Mr. Whitmore, we've got company. 3 cars now, trying to box us in." Charles felt his pulse spike. "Can you lose them?" "I can try, but they're professionals." "And sir?" "I recognize one of the drivers. He used to work for a security company that handles difficult situations for wealthy clients." The implications were clear. This wasn't just surveillance anymore. It was preparation for something more direct and dangerous. "Marcus, get us to the NYPD headquarters," Charles said. "If they want to intimidate us, let them do it in front of witnesses." "Smart," Elena said. "And while we're there, we can file a formal complaint about harassment and intimidation." As they wove through Manhattan traffic toward police headquarters, Charles's phone rang. The caller ID showed Patricia Newman. "Charles, don't go home tonight," she said without preamble. "I just got a call from a source inside Coleman's office. There's going to be a coordinated media campaign starting tomorrow, painting you as a mentally unstable man obsessed with conspiracy theories. They have documentation suggesting you've been having psychological problems since your divorce." "Fabricated documentation?" "Almost certainly, but convincing. And Charles, there's talk of having you involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation. It would be a legal way to neutralize you while they clean up whatever evidence you might have." Elena grabbed the phone. "Patricia, this is Elena. How much time do we have?" "Hours, not days. If you're going to make a move, it has to be tonight." Charles looked at his sister, saw his own determination reflected in her eyes, and made a decision that would either save them or destroy them completely. "Patricia, publish the story. Everything we gave you, everything we discussed. Don't wait for more sources or additional verification. Get it online tonight." "Charles, without more corroboration, they'll tear it apart legally." "Maybe, but at least our side will be public. Once the story is out there, it becomes much harder for us to simply disappear." There was silence on the phone as Patricia considered the risks. Finally, she spoke. "I'll need a few hours to write it up and get it past legal. Can you stay safe until then?" Charles looked out the window at the black sedan still following them, at the city that had once felt like home but now seemed full of enemies, and realized that safety was no longer an option. "We'll stay alive," he said. "That's the best I can promise." As they pulled up to police headquarters, Charles took Elena's hand, the same gesture of protection he'd offered 40 years ago when they were children facing an uncertain future. "Ready for this, Hermana?" "Ready," she said, squeezing his hand. "Let's go make some noise." The fluorescent lights of the NYPD precinct cast harsh shadows as Charles and Elena sat across from Detective Lisa Chun, a 20-year veteran who specialized in organized crime and corruption cases. Her expression remained professionally neutral as she reviewed the harassment complaint they'd filed, but Charles could see the skepticism in her eyes. Another wealthy Hamptons resident with paranoid delusions about being followed. "Mr. Whitmore, Detective Chun said, closing the folder. I understand you feel threatened, but surveillance isn't illegal unless we can prove stalking or direct intimidation. Without evidence of actual crimes being committed. What about the falsified financial documents my accountant was coerced into preparing? Charles interrupted. Isn't that fraud? Conspiracy. If we can prove coercion. But corporate accounting disputes fall under federal jurisdiction, not local police. Chen leaned back in her chair. Look, I'll be honest with you. 3 prominent citizens like Logan Mitchell, Natalie Cross, and Senator Coleman don't usually engage in the kind of criminal conspiracy you're describing. Elena pulled out her phone, showing Chen photographs of the community living on their parents' stolen land. Detective, 43 families are living on property that was fraudulently taken from our parents 40 years ago. We have documentation proving the theft, witness testimony about the intimidation that preceded our parents' deaths. Alleged intimidation, and deaths that were ruled accidental by the coroner. Chen's tone softened slightly. Ms. Rodriguez, I'm not dismissing your concerns, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. What you're describing would involve dozens of co-conspirators across multiple agencies over 4 decades. Charles felt his frustration mounting. Even with Detective Murphy's files, even with documented proof of fraud, the scope of the conspiracy was so vast that it seemed unbelievable to anyone who hadn't lived through it. Detective Chun, he said carefully, what would convince you to take this seriously? A body, a smoking gun, someone with direct knowledge willing to testify under oath. Chen stood, signaling the end of their meeting. I'll file your complaint, increase patrols in your area for a few days, but unless something concrete happens. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text. As she read it, her expression changed dramatically. Mr. Whitmore, you said your accountant was being coerced regarding his daughter's medical care. Yes, George Morrison's daughter has leukemia. They control her access to experimental treatments. We just got a call from Mount Sinai Hospital. A 15-year-old girl named Jennifer Morrison was admitted an hour ago with what appears to be deliberate insulin poisoning. She's not diabetic. Elena gasped. They're escalating. Or sending a message, Charles said grimly. George must have told them he was cooperating with us. Detective Chun was already reaching for her jacket. I'm going to the hospital. If this girl was poisoned as part of an intimidation campaign, this becomes attempted murder. She looked at Charles seriously. Mr. Whitmore, if even half of what you've told me is true, you and your sister are in immediate danger. Do you have somewhere safe you can stay tonight? Charles was about to answer when his phone rang. Patricia Newman's name appeared on the screen. Patricia, he answered. Charles, we have a problem. My editor just killed the story. Her voice was tight with anger and frustration. 10 minutes ago, he received calls from 3 board members of the Times parent company. Apparently, publishing unsubstantiated allegations against Senator Coleman could jeopardize the paper's access to federal sources and government contracts. Elena leaned close to hear the conversation. So they got to your editor? They got to people above my editor. People I didn't even know could influence editorial decisions. Patricia paused. Charles, this goes higher than we thought. These aren't just corrupt local officials. They have connections at the federal level. Detective Chun, overhearing the conversation, took the phone from Charles. Ms. Newman, this is Detective Chun, NYPD. We may have an attempted murder connected to this case. I need you to hold on to every piece of evidence you've gathered. Detective, I'm a journalist, not a witness. I can't just. You can and you will if a federal investigation gets opened. Which, given what I just heard, seems increasingly likely. As they left the precinct, Charles felt the net closing around them. The story had been killed, their credibility was being systematically destroyed, and now George's daughter had been poisoned as a warning. Their enemies weren't just powerful, they were desperate enough to hurt children. We need to get to George, Elena said as they climbed into Marcus's car. If his daughter was poisoned, he's probably already been contacted, Charles finished. Given an ultimatum, withdraw his cooperation or lose his daughter permanently. Charles's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The girl lives if the investigation stops. Choose carefully. Jesus Christ, Marcus said, reading over Charles's shoulder. Sir, these people are serious. Maybe it's time to consider backing down. No. The voice came from Elena, but it carried a steel that surprised everyone in the car. They've been terrorizing families for 40 years. How many children have suffered because we were too afraid to fight back? How many parents died thinking their children would never know the truth? Charles looked at his sister and saw not the quiet housekeeper he'd known, but the fierce protector who had tried to shield him from social workers 40 years ago. Elena, if we continue this, we might not survive. If we stop now, we definitely won't survive, she replied. They'll destroy us anyway, just more slowly. At least if we fight, we have a chance to take them down with us. Detective Chen's phone rang. After a brief conversation, she hung up with a grim expression. Jennifer Morrison is stable but critical. The doctors say it was definitely deliberate poisoning, a massive insulin overdose designed to send a message but not necessarily kill. Not necessarily? Charles felt sick. They wanted her to suffer, wanted her father to see what they're capable of. It's psychological warfare. Chun turned to face them. This changes everything. We now have clear evidence of criminal intimidation involving assault on a minor. I'm opening a full investigation. Will that be enough to protect us? It's a start. But Charles, Elena, these people have just shown they're willing to poison children to protect their secrets. You need to assume they'll escalate to lethal force. As if summoned by her words, Marcus's voice cut through the tension. Sir, we're being followed again. Same vehicles as before, but they're not being subtle anymore. Through the rear window, Charles could see 3 black SUVs maintaining formation behind them. These weren't private investigators or corporate security. They moved with military precision. Detective, Charles said urgently, can you arrange protective custody? For how long? Days? Weeks? Unless we can build a prosecutable case quickly, all I can do is delay the inevitable. Chen was already on her radio, calling for backup units. Your only real protection is making this story so public that silencing you becomes more dangerous than letting you live. Elena pulled out her phone. Then we go around the traditional media. Social media, independent journalists, anyone who will listen. They'll discredit us faster than we can get the story out, Charles said. Not if we have something they can't explain away. Elena's eyes were bright with determination. Charles, what if we could get one of them to confess? What if we could record them admitting to the crimes? How? They'll never meet with us voluntarily. Elena smiled, and Charles recognized the expression from their childhood. It meant she had a dangerous but potentially brilliant idea. They won't meet with us, she said. But they might meet with someone they think they can control. Who? Victoria. She's their inside source, their way of monitoring and manipulating you. What if we turned her? Charles felt a spark of hope mixed with dread. Elena, Victoria sold me out. She's working for them. Because they have leverage over her, just like they had leverage over George. But what if we could offer her something they can't? What if we could give her a way out that doesn't involve our destruction? Detective Chun looked between the siblings with growing understanding. You want to flip her? Make her wear a wire. Get them to confess on tape. It's insane, Charles said. It's our only chance, Elena replied. Charles, you know Victoria better than anyone. What does she want more than anything else? Charles thought about his ex-wife, her desperate need for security, her fear of being abandoned, her carefully constructed facade of sophistication built on a foundation of deep insecurity. Safety, he said finally. Victoria has always been terrified of being poor, of being powerless, of being alone. If we could offer her immunity from prosecution, witness protection if necessary. And if she refuses? Charles looked out at the SUVs still following them, thought about George's daughter lying poisoned in a hospital bed, considered the community of families living on his parents' stolen land who had no idea they were about to become casualties in a war they didn't start. Then we find another way, he said. Because Elena's right, we can't stop fighting now. Too many people are counting on us to finally tell the truth. As Manhattan's lights blurred past the car windows, Charles realized they were no longer trying to uncover a conspiracy. They were racing to expose it before it destroyed them completely. The next 12 hours would determine not just their fate, but the fate of every family whose lives had been shattered by 40 years of systematic fraud and corruption. Time was running out, and their enemies knew exactly where to find them. The penthouse suite at the Four Seasons had been Charles's idea. Neutral territory where Victoria would feel comfortable, public enough to provide some safety, private enough for the conversation that would either save them or seal their fate. Charles sat across from his ex-wife at the marble dining table, while Elena waited in the adjacent bedroom, monitoring the wire that Detective Chun had helped them arrange. The FBI had finally taken interest after Jennifer Morrison's poisoning, and Agent Sarah Martinez was coordinating from a command center 3 floors below. Victoria looked immaculate as always, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her Chanel suit flawless, but Charles could see the fear beneath her composed exterior. She kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting snipers, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her wine glass. "Charles, when you called, I thought you'd finally come to your senses," Victoria said, her voice carefully modulated but carrying an undertone of desperation. "This whole crusade of yours, it's going to destroy us both." "Us?" Charles leaned forward. "Victoria, there is no us. You made that clear when you chose to work for the people who destroyed my family. I didn't have a choice." The facade cracked, revealing raw panic underneath. "Do you think I wanted to spy on you? Do you think I enjoyed being their messenger? Then help me understand. What hold do they have over you?" Victoria stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, her silhouette framed against the city lights. "Remember my father's hedge fund? The one that collapsed right before our divorce?" Charles nodded. Richard Pemberton's fund had been a Wall Street legend until it imploded overnight, taking billions in investor money with it. It didn't collapse because of market forces, Charles. It collapsed because Logan Mitchell needed it to collapse. Victoria's voice grew quiet, haunted. "My father discovered that several of his major investments were in properties that had been fraudulently acquired. When he threatened to expose the scheme, they destroyed him. Systematically. They manipulated his positions, spread rumors about his mental state, leaked false information about insider trading. Within 6 months, he went from managing $12 billion to being investigated by the SEC. Victoria turned back to face Charles. He killed himself rather than face prison for crimes he didn't commit. The revelation hit Charles like a physical blow. He'd known Victoria's father, had respected the man's integrity and intelligence. To learn that Richard Pemberton had been murdered, because that's what it was, even if no one had pulled a trigger, added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating story. "Victoria, why didn't you tell me this during our marriage?" "Because I was afraid you'd try to investigate, just like you're doing now. And I'd already lost my father. I couldn't bear to lose you too." Tears began streaming down her cheeks. "But when I left for Europe, they followed me. Made it clear that my father's suicide could be revealed as murder unless I cooperated." Through his earpiece, Charles heard Agent Martinez's voice. "She's telling the truth. We've been investigating the Pemberton case as part of a broader financial fraud probe." Charles felt the pieces falling into place. Victoria hadn't been a willing collaborator. She'd been another victim, manipulated through grief and fear into betraying the man she'd once loved. "Victoria, what did they ask you to do?" "Monitor your activities, report on your state of mind, gain access to your financial records." She wiped her eyes, smearing her carefully applied makeup. "When you started investigating your family's past, they wanted to know everything. What you discovered, who you were talking to, how serious you were about pursuing justice. And when they realized I wasn't going to back down, they told me to deliver one final message." Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. "They want you to sign these documents. Agreements to sell various properties to shell companies they control, transfers of assets that would essentially bankrupt you over time." Charles opened the envelope, scanning the legal documents that would strip away his fortune piece by piece while maintaining the illusion of legitimate business transactions. "And if I refuse, they'll release fabricated evidence of financial crimes, have you committed for psychiatric evaluation, and ensure that both you and Elena disappear permanently." Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper. "Charles, they killed my father. They poisoned a 15-year-old girl. What do you think they'll do to you? Help us stop them." The words came from Elena, who emerged from the bedroom where she'd been listening. Victoria startled, clearly not expecting Charles's sister to be present. "Elena? What are you?" "I'm his sister, his partner, and right now, his best hope for survival." Elena sat down across from Victoria. "Just like you are." Victoria looked confused. "I don't understand." Charles leaned forward. "Victoria, we know about Mitchell, Cross, and Coleman. We know about the systematic fraud, the property theft, the families they've destroyed over 4 decades. But we need proof, recordings, documents, direct testimony from someone they trust. You want me to wear a wire?" We want you to help us end this, Elena said. Not just for Charles, not just for our family, but for your father and every other victim they've created. Victoria stood abruptly, pacing to the window again. You don't understand what you're asking. These people don't just ruin lives, they end them. If they discover I've betrayed them, they're going to kill us anyway, Charles said quietly. All of us. They can't let any of the witnesses survive, and that includes you, Victoria. You know too much about their operations. Through his earpiece, Agent Martinez's voice was urgent. Charles, we're picking up suspicious activity in the hotel. Multiple vehicles arriving, communications chatter suggesting they're mobilizing for something. Charles felt his blood chill. Victoria, did anyone know you were coming here? I was supposed to report back after delivering their message. Victoria's face went pale. Oh God, they're not planning to let any of us leave, are they? Elena was already moving toward the door. We need to go? Now. But as they reached the suite's entrance, Charles's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Top floor. Come alone, or everyone dies. It's a trap, Elena said. Of course it's a trap, Charles replied. But what choice do we have? Victoria grabbed his arm. Charles, don't go up there. Please. I'll testify. I'll wear a wire. I'll do whatever you need. Just don't walk into their trap. Charles looked at his sister, then at his ex-wife, and realized that for the first time in his adult life, he had people who were willing to risk everything for him. The isolation that had defined his existence was finally broken. Agent Martinez, he said aloud, knowing she could hear him through the wire. Are your people in position? FBI tactical teams are moving into the building. Charles, we need 5 more minutes. I don't think we have 5 minutes. Charles moved toward the elevator. Elena, Victoria, get to the stairwell. If this goes wrong, we're not leaving you, Elena said firmly. And I'm not running again, Victoria added, surprising them both with her resolve. I've been their victim for too long. It's time to fight back. The elevator rose toward the penthouse level, carrying the 3 of them toward a confrontation that would either expose the conspiracy that had shaped their lives or silence them forever. Charles thought about the community living on his parents' land, about George Morrison's poisoned daughter, about Detective Murphy and Victoria's father, and countless other victims whose stories might never be told. As the elevator doors opened onto the hotel's top floor, Charles saw Logan Mitchell waiting for them, flanked by armed men who definitely weren't hotel security. Behind Mitchell stood Natalie Cross and Senator Coleman, their faces masks of cold determination. Mr. Whitmore, Mitchell said with false courtesy. Ms. Rodriguez. Victoria, I believe it's time we had a frank discussion about the future. Charles stepped forward, knowing that Elena and Victoria were recording everything through their concealed devices, hoping that Agent Martinez's tactical teams were close enough to intervene. I couldn't agree more, Charles said. Let's talk about the past 40 years. Let's talk about murder, fraud, and the systematic destruction of innocent families. Let's talk about justice. Mitchell smiled coldly. Justice, Mr. Whitmore, is what the powerful decide it is. And you are about to discover that some fights cannot be won. As the confrontation began, Charles realized that everything, his wealth, his sister, his chance at redemption, and the lives of 43 families living on stolen land, depended on the next few minutes. The final battle for the truth was about to begin. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and if you watched until here, comment, I watched until here, and leave your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen for you. It's very exciting.